Hello, and welcome to the Sangamon Experience. My name is Ann Moseley, and tonight we have a special program for you called Central Illinois in the Time of Cholera. And we have our special guest here today, named Michael Moseley. He is the curator of the Pearson Museum at the SIU School of Medicine. And he's been with the school for over 8 years, and he has also been the curator for about a year and a half. And most of his job currently has been going through all of the medical equipment and medicines they have within the collection and organizing it. And he has discovered a number of very interesting and unique items within the collection. The SIU School of Medicine Pearson Museum is a community partner with the Sangamon Experience. And what that is whenever we put on programs and they have a program already put together that they'd like to highlight, they partner with us so we can share the platform with them and highlighting the history of Central Illinois and Sangamon County. Now, a few housekeeping items that I'd like to share with you. So as you can see, we are live on Facebook, but we're also live on YouTube. If you have a question for Mike, we will be having a Q&A at the end of the program. And if you have a question, feel free to type it in the comments, and we'll be able to get to them at the end. In addition, if you like a question and you want it to be moved up on the question roll, just like it, and we'll be able to move that above as well. Also, something that we really like to do here on our Facebook Live programs is to ask, where are you tuning in from? Are you here in Illinois? Are you from out of state? And just let us know where you're from so we can get to know each other. You never know, you might meet someone in your neck of the woods that has the same interest in the topic of the evening as well. So without further ado, I'm going to send the mic over to Mike, where he can get our program started.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mike, as Ann said, and I'm here to talk to you about Central Illinois during the second cholera pandemic. And what I'm going to try to do is kind of put this into context, in like a larger context within sort of world history, and just sort of tell you, where Sangamon County sort of stood and all that. So I guess I will get started. So here we go. Writing in 1830 to a prospective immigrant to the area, Springfield Presbyterian pastor John Bergen wrote that two of our physicians, one having received his education in Philadelphia and the other in New York, and both having been in this country about 10 years, agree in stating that these parts are as healthy as any in the West. Even in the first settling of it, the immigrants here did not suffer so much with sickness as they did who first felt the timbers of Kentucky, Ohio, and New York. This view could be at best described as optimistic, but could be a reflection of the desire to attract new people to the Sangamon country. In reality, disease was a fact of life to those settlers who decided to make a new life for themselves in the West, and Illinois was no exception. Malarial fevers in particular were endemic to Illinois. Ague, or the shakes, as they were called, I've also seen them called the Illinois shakes, encompassed a variety of actual diseases, but as symptoms were not terribly distinct, they were all assumed to be the same and treated as such. Courses of treatment generally consisted of bloodletting, which certainly did more harm than good, and doses of quinine, which were effective for malaria itself, but not much else. Also included in treatments were various other substances, chief among which would have been mercury, along with a variety of herbal preparations. Those who had malaria would have recovered thanks to the quinine, and those who did not have malaria and recovered probably would have gotten better without treatment anyway. The state of medicine at the time of the founding of Sangamon County had not advanced much beyond that of the 17th century. Louis Pasteur was still years away from developing germ theory in the late 1850s, And it would really not be until the 1880s, when Robert Koch expanded upon his work, that it would be widely accepted. While knowledge of anatomy had advanced significantly by the 19th century, surgery was still a highly dangerous affair. Aseptic surgery had not yet been developed, and someone undergoing surgery could only expect a 50% survival rate because of the risk of infection. For this reason, and the fact that anesthesia was not yet available, surgeons would generally limit their operations to amputation. The understanding of infectious disease would have been wholly foreign to the modern observer as well. Rather than bacteria and viruses, diseases was understood to be spread by miasmas, also called bad air. Also called night air, these miasmas were believed to be produced by the putrefaction of organic matter and were associated particularly with low-lying areas, swamps, and marshes. Several epidemics were explained by this theory, one of the more famous being the Philadelphia yellow fever outbreak in 1793. Founding Father Benjamin Rush, also a physician, blamed the outbreak on damaged coffee, which putrefied on a wharf near Arch Street. Naturally, many public health initiatives were focused on ridding locations of this bad air. This was not wholly useless, as some of the substances which were used in the putrefaction of the air, purification of the air, did in fact have antimicrobial properties. So this picture is actually a guy, he's holding his nose to try to keep miasmas out. And we've probably all seen those kind of bird-like plague doctor masks, and those were built with the intent of also filtering out miasmas. Those beaks would be filled with like fragrant herbs and flowers and such. At the time of its settling, Sangamon County contained little to nothing in the way of infrastructure. Sewage systems did not exist in the modern sense, but there was a recognition that sanitation was important in the building of a community. About 1820, the first settlers of Springfield convened to discuss the sanitation of the new village. As a result, the settlers' dooryards were made to drain into the town branch, Watson's branch, Kelly's branch, and the other brooks and waterways that coursed between the bluffs and knolls that gave rugged character to the locality. The town branch played an important role in the sanitary history of Springfield. The creek ran from the southeast of Springfield through what is now the governor's mansion onto the State Armory building and continued on a northwesterly direction where it met Spring Creek. In two locations along its route, it opened up and could be accessed for a variety of uses. One of these, at the current location of 5th and Jackson Streets, was known as the baptizing hole, which was used for swimming and fishing. The other at 7th Street, near its intersection with Cook, was known as the bottomless hole. You can see it on this map, the body of water there. It had many uses, among which were swimming and fishing, and would have undoubtedly served as a major water source for the early town. While this arrangement functioned well enough when Springfield was limited to a few cabins, it soon became an issue. As the population grew, the creek became polluted with waste and was little more than an open sewer, and would have undoubtedly been a source of disease, both from microbes and mosquitoes, especially in the summer months. Added to that was the fact it was constantly flooding during heavy rains. Eventually it was covered up, but you can still see part of the town branch today. If you go on to Lincoln Avenue, north of Jefferson, it is still there. It looks like a drainage ditch now, but it's still what's left of the town branch. Outside of the town branch, Springfield was not known for its cleanliness. Roads were made of dirt, which turned into muddy quagmires during rain, providing plenty of breeding ground for mosquitoes. Livestock roamed the streets, rooting up sidewalk planks to look for food. Combine this with the general view of sanitation and medicine of the day, and it was a perfect environment for the spread of disease. This was the general state of affairs in Springfield and Greater Sangamon County when the first ships left Liverpool, England in 1832, carrying a disease which had never before been seen in the New World, cholera. Prior to the 19th century, cholera was almost unknown in Europe and the Americas. There was a disease well known to inhabitants in those areas, however, known as cholera morbus. This was simply a term used to refer to gastroenteritis, or what we would call stomach flu, probably. This was typically seen during the summer months and would involve cramps, diarrhea, and sometimes vomiting. Rarely was it fatal, with most people recovering in short order. Conversely, Asiatic cholera was extremely deadly, with a mortality rate of around 50%. It had been known to European observers as early as the 1600s, but it had stayed confined to India. Asiatic cholera itself is a bacterial disease caused by the bacteria Vibrio cholerae. It's waterborne and spread when an individual ingests fecal contaminated water, whether by drinking or using it to prepare food. It's worth noting that unlike a virus like smallpox, cholera can survive outside of a human host, allowing it to spread in previously clean water once introduced. This would also make it incredibly difficult to eradicate. While modern sanitation methods ensure that it is extremely rare in the developed world, it is far from being a problem of the past. Outbreaks still occur regularly in developing countries, and especially in areas subject to disasters and social upheaval. Yemen, for example, is currently in the midst of an outbreak, having seen 1.2 million cases and 2,500 deaths, over half of which were children. Thanks to modern treatment methods and the oral cholera vaccine provided by humanitarian organizations, fatalities are much lower than they otherwise would have been. These treatments were not available in the 19th century, however. For most of history, cholera had been limited to India, with outbreaks waxing and waning over time. The situation changed in 1817 when cholera escaped India for the first time ever. Numerous factors likely contributed to this, but the growth of the British Empire and the increased trade it brought was certainly one of the chief factors. What would eventually become known as the first cholera pandemic spread throughout Southeast Asia, Japan, China, and the Middle East, reaching to the Mediterranean coast. The exact number of victims are unknown, but the number of deaths were somewhere over 1.2 million by the time the pandemic ended in 1824. Accounts of this tragedy would still be fresh in the mind of people just 2 years later, when news of another outbreak began appearing. Slowly but surely, the disease crept out of India and spread through Russia, which was particularly hard hit. The Tsarist government issued strict anti-cholera regulation, resulting in riots, but the disease still spread throughout Europe and eventually into Great Britain in December 1831. Accounts of the spread of cholera in Europe and Asia appeared regularly in the Sangamo Journal, even from the very first issue, which informed readers that cholera had been brought to Semlin, Serbia, aboard a ship, and the next day 12 people became infected. To a surprising extent, residents of Springfield who read the journal would have been aware of the movement of cholera across Europe and Asia. It is probably fair to say, though, that because of the distance between Europe and North America, and Springfield and the more populated areas of the United States, that this didn't cause much worry. However, because of actions taken on the other side of the Atlantic, this relative peace wouldn't last. In the late 1820s, continental European authorities used strict policing methods to try and control the spread of disease. This involved setting up cordon sanitaires enforced by the military, forcibly removing people from their homes, and in Prussia, at least, threatening death to those who violated orders to quarantine. Much of this enraged the populace. In Russia, like I said, there were a series of cholera riots, and in Western Europe saw massive upheaval, nearing in some cases revolution. In fact, it was probably the closest England ever came to a revolution. Although the disease was not well understood, quarantine probably would have worked. The issue with this was twofold. First, the people saw the heavy-handed nature of the quarantine and resisted. Furthermore, people didn't understand why they would need to be quarantined in the first place, even if they were healthy. Some even doubted that there was a threat from cholera at all. A lot of them actually believed that doctors had made it up. One traveler from Great Britain to Genoa echoed this when he found himself in the Genoese Lazaretto, which is the picture there. It is a quarantine station for sea travelers. Quote, "He told me that my life here would be a foretaste of what a prison would be, but I replied that were I to commit a crime deserving imprisonment, I should be glad to hide myself in such a place, and would at least submit as being what I deserved, whereas here I was in prison for neither crime nor ill health, but from the mere fancy that cholera was in England. Indeed, this lazaretto is all trick, for when the captain complained about coffee being put in here, they told him that it was the only way they could taste it and give employment to the porters. While this sort of attitude was certainly a factor in the anemic European response, economic interests played an even larger role. Merchants quickly rose, quote, the specter of the laboring classes, deprived of a living and driven to desperation, so that the flames of rebellion would be fanned from the east as well as from Paris, the traditional home of European revolutions in the West, unquote. Mercantile interests were paramount. The state withdrew almost entirely from the fight against cholera. This was certainly the case in Liverpool, one of the most overcrowded and unsanitary cities in England. Asiatic cholera was assumed to be heading toward the city, so a central board of health was formed to advise on ways to combat the disease. Members of the local medical community had not been consulted on the formation of the board. Rather, members had been appointed by the mayor and the magistrates of the city. Also, people who had a direct economic interest. The first official case of cholera in Liverpool occurred on May 17, 1832, although it was almost certainly in the city much earlier. Earlier cases were denied to be Asiatic cholera by the board in order to preserve economic interests. Consequences of the misplaced priorities of the Board of Health and the misplaced attitudes of the people were realized when the ship Brutus sailed from Liverpool bound for Quebec on May 18, 1832. While at sea, the ship suffered a cholera outbreak where there were 117 reported cases and 81 deaths. Less than 2 months later, about the time it took for a ship to cross the Atlantic, a headline appeared in the Sangmo Journal stating cholera had made it to Canada. The article stated that great alarm exists in Albany, Troy, New York, and other eastern cities, and the most energetic measures have been taken to prevent, if possible, the introduction of this terrible scourge into the United States. It was already too late. The disease would spread almost unchecked across the country. The seriousness of the situation would not have been lost on residents of Sangamon County. Although probably none of them had experienced the disease firsthand, they were, thanks to the paper, familiar with its presentation. The patient generally complains at first of nausea, uneasiness in the stomach and bowels, presently followed by vomiting of fluid resembling rice water or thin gruel, and frequent evacuations from the bowels of a similar appearance. Cramps in the toes and fingers, rapidly spreading up the arms and legs to the chest and abdomen when the sufferings of the patient become truly distressing. The pulse, at first weak and fluctuating, becomes lost at the wrist, and generally not even distinguishable at the precordial region. The strongest voice becomes puerile, and the last hoarse and whispering. The tongue and face is cold. The skin is cold as marble and livid. The urine completely suppressed. The cramps, vomiting, and purging generally cease. The movements of the chest and respiration scarcely visible. And were it not for the placid and rational answers to questions, you would suppose the body had been dead for hours. So, in fact, looks like a living corpse. Such is the assemblage of symptoms in this dreadful malady. It doesn't mention this, but it actually had the tendency to turn people blue. They were lacking in so much oxygen. Such was the anxiety surrounding the advance of cholera that there was at least one example of it prompting suicide. A story emerged of an elderly man from Philadelphia who said in his note, quote, "I was seized with the most indescribable feeling of horrible dread, lest I should fall a victim to its ravages. And rather than endure the excruciating torments of an attack of this fatal disease, or see my family cut down around me, I have come to the determination of escaping the dreaded evil by dying an easy death, and it will be vain for you to attempt to thwart my designs." On July 19th, 1832, the Springfield Board of Health felt compelled to prepare for what they believed was the inevitable. The board passed a resolution directing residents of Springfield, quote, "to remove all nuisances on their premises, to purify by a free use of lime all cellars, sinkholes, gutters, etc., and to remove all vegetable substances in putrefying condition on their premises, and to request them to unite with the Board of Trustees and the Board of Health in removing every cause of disease which may be found within the limits of the town. Furthermore, it states that the Board of Health be requested to make a thorough examination of the town with the object of discovering nuisances which may be the cause of disease, unquote. These directions were aimed at avoiding miasmas from arising and infecting residents, as lime was one of a handful of substances which were thought to be effective in disinfecting putrefying material. For roughly the next year, Springfield residents were constantly reading about the ravages of cholera throughout the nation. The disease prevailed to such an extent that a joint resolution in the U.S. House of Representatives was taken up for consideration regarding, quote, an appointment of a day of fasting, prayer, and humiliation to avert the divine wrath as manifested by the progress of the cholera. It became clear that the divine wrath would not be averted for long, as it continued to creep closer and closer. A letter from General Winfield Scott appeared in the journal, which stated that the disease was running rampant through his command at Fort Dearborn. According to him, it was brought from Buffalo, New York, with his forces. The disease spread throughout the battalion for 3 days, infecting about 120 people and killing 50. Constant talk of the advance and deadliness of the disease must have caused considerable alarm, as the State Journal, or Sangamo Journal, was prompted to run a lengthy editorial from the Springfield Board of Health, describing its causes, symptoms, and treatments. While still hoping that Springfield would be spared, they nonetheless wished to put citizens in a position to, quote, repel the attacks of the disease, or at least mitigate its severity, while assuring people that if the disease is caught early, it could be easily cured. The board stressed the stakes of the situation, saying, when, quote, the epidemic is suffered to make a lodgment in the system, it is almost necessary that it terminated fatally, in which case all may perish. While the advice is not particularly good by modern standards, it does reveal much about the medicine of the day. The board emphasized that the predisposing cause of the disease was beyond the ability of the individual to avoid, but exciting causes could be controlled. These exciting causes were intemperance in various areas. The board advised against intemperance in eating and drinking, inordinate exercise, checking of the perspiration, exposure to the night air, excessive fatigue, change of habit, improper articles of diet, anxiety of mind, and fear of the disease itself. The board also advised that should one believe they have the disease, they should go to bed immediately and call for a doctor. In addition, they should take a powder of calomel and opium and repeat a half dose every hour. If the patient finds it necessary, they should induce perspiration by drinking a tea made from sage, balm, red pepper, or snake root. And if vomiting or cramps happen, then they should apply a mustard plaster to the stomach and heated rocks to the body and extremities. They also advise that legs and arms should be rubbed with dry mustard or red peppers and brandy. If necessary, the patient should take some castor oil. We'll talk about treatments more in depth later, but because of the nature of cholera, these were all extremely dangerous. In just a short paragraph after the editorial, the paper informed readers that the board had also been busy in procuring a building to use as a hospital for travelers and the indigent. Apparently, the hospital was fully funded by contributions of the public and would be staffed by board members themselves free of charge. It illustrates the importance with which the citizenry placed on public health, with money coming directly from the residents and what you could describe as an early form of crowdfunding. It certainly seemed Springfield was not interested in experiencing what had been happening in the Northeast, as well as St. Louis and especially New Orleans. Reading about the ravages of the disease in these two places were bound to have raised some eyebrows. New Orleans in particular was experiencing dreadful conditions, as the cholera pandemic was exacerbated by a yellow fever epidemic. Accurate numbers are difficult to come by, but estimates appearing in the journal indicate anywhere from 150 to 200 deaths a day were occurring in that city. It was also reported that the city of Palmyra, Missouri, directly west from Springfield, just across the Mississippi, had suffered 106 deaths. This would have represented a massive toll for such a small town. St. Louis was hard hit as well. Central Illinois residents would have been well aware of this situation, not only from newspaper accounts, but from letters from friends and acquaintances. Writing to Mr. Scripps of Rushville, A. McAllister told of the situation in St. Louis. There are perhaps 1,000 persons who fled from the city. I was advised by our family physician to move into the country, but thought best to stay and render such assistance as I can to the distressed and cast myself and my family at the feet of mercy. I hope you may not feel this awful visitation in your little town. Persons were attacked here who died in 3 hours, unquote. A.D. Williams, writing from Gallatin County, Kentucky, said, quote, the cholera is raging in Louisville and Cincinnati and Lexington from 40 to 50 a day. The disease has not got to our country yet. The people are much alarmed. Many deaths in Henry and Gallatin, too legion to mention, unquote. Clearly, the cholera was advancing up the Mississippi at the same time it was advancing from the east and was closing in on central Illinois like a pincer. It had been assumed that locations away from major rivers and streams would be relatively safe from the disease. However, it became clear that this would not be the case. Reports were emerging of outbreaks all over the countryside. Lexington, Kentucky, a good distance from any major rivers, for example, suffered its first case on June 2nd, 1833, and 4 days later, 27 had died. It became clear with the reports from all over the nation that Springfield would no longer be safe. The Sangamo Journal published an editorial on June 22nd, 1833, stating, we can no longer, with any degree of propriety, expect that our location, at a distance from any large streams, will secure from us a visitation by the cholera. It becomes our citizens to be prepared to meet it. All experience proves that the disease is within the control of medicine if properly and timely administered. The destroying angel may come upon us at a day and hour for which we have made no preparation, and which may then be fatal. Less than 2 weeks later, the first case appeared in Springfield. Luckily, by the end of the pandemic, Springfield had been spared the worst of the cholera. Over the course of 2 years, only about 40 deaths occurred. Still, considering the size of the city, about 1,000 people, it's a surprisingly high percentage. We unfortunately will never know how many people were infected in the first place, but it seems the early efforts by the Springfield Board of Health were at least partially effective. Other cities in central Illinois were not so lucky, though. Lists of names of those who passed away frequently appeared in the paper. Quincy in particular was hard hit, probably because of its proximity to the Mississippi. Between June 7th and July 17th, 1833, 28 people succumbed to the disease, many of whom were children under the age of 10, with the youngest being a child of a Dr. Ross, aged 4 months. It was also recorded that most of these people died within 7 to 12 hours after the first attack. Jonathan Baldwin Turner, in a letter dated August 28, 1833, confirmed the damage being dealt. 1/6 of the entire population of Carrollton had died, 1/5 of the population in Palmyra, and 1/15 of the population in Quincy. Most contrasting to Springfield was the town of Jacksonville. Before the pandemic was over, it is estimated that over half the population contracted the disease, and the mortality was staggering. Dr. A.G. Henry of Springfield, who was helping to tend to the sick in Jacksonville, wrote in a letter to some residents in Springfield that, quote, it will be the turn of your town next. Springfield can't, in the nature of things, escape the pestilence. Be prepared then to meet it like men and Christians, unquote. This letter happened to spark some controversy, with Henry blaming the pestilence on moral causes rather than physical. He particularly disliked those who fled to the country to escape the disease, calling them, quote, destitute of moral courage, unquote. He also went on to assure the readers that the cholera is not catching. In other words, it's not contagious. He then attacked the medical establishment for the use of calomel in treating cholera. Rather, he advocated bleeding, camphor, and laudanum. At least one resident, and probably more, of Jacksonville took exception to the claim that moral causes had more to do with the spread of the disease than anything else. The unnamed citizen wrote to a friend in Springfield, with a copy appearing in the journal, that Dr. Henry was completely wrong about his claims, except that cholera is not contagious. As for the moral cause, the citizen states that, quote, "Our citizens have generally been prudent and temperate, and we are satisfied that the cholera has no respect for places, persons, ages, or sex. We are all alike liable to its attacks," unquote. He also assured that if Springfield were visited by the epidemic on the same level as Jacksonville, plenty of its citizens would flee. According to him, neither denunciations nor kind advice will keep them together. The reason for this, he says, is that Illinois is a newly settled country, and society had not had a chance to coalesce and allow people to form close relationships. Dr. Henry wrote one last letter defending himself before the controversy seemed to be dropped. In it, he defended his suggestion of moral cause of the disease and criticism of the use of calomel. Certainly, Dr. Henry had interesting ideas about the origin and treatment of cholera, especially according to the medical establishment, but they weren't terribly out of line with certain sections of the population. Aside from the medical view that the disease was caused by miasma, many viewed it as a punishment from God. While cholera was confined to Europe and Asia, many assumed that the United States would be spared, thanks in part to the Second Great Awakening and the piousness it conferred on the people. Of course, this view was threatened when the disease crossed the Atlantic. Instead, it was argued, similarly to Dr. Henry, that only the immoral individual would be affected. This made some sense, as cities were assumed to be the center of immorality, and they tended to be hit the hardest. Really, like today, socioeconomic factors tend to be more telling as to who would contract a given disease. The poor in cities were often crowded into tenements without reliable access to clean water. While general immorality was believed to be a cause of cholera, a specific type believed to be to blame was intemperance. It would have been, if not generally accepted, then certainly widely accepted that intemperance was a cause, or at least an exacerbating factor, of cholera, and the temperate had little to fear. Springfield readers would have been familiar with this idea, as it appeared in the paper with some regularity. An account from New York stated, quote, "The disease is still more confined to the wretched victims of sensuality and intemperance than at first. There are some exceptions, though their number is small, but it ought to be distinctly understood, here and everywhere, that what the lightning accomplishes here in the natural world, the cholera does in the moral. Both sometimes depart from the main subject of their mission, but notwithstanding these exceptions, the general rule remains. And we think it would not be a bad definition of the cholera, that it is a judgment from God on unrestrained licentiousness. In a sense, then, cholera was here to do good by ridding society of undesirables, and the editor of the Sangamo Journal seemed to give tacit approval of that concept. The writer for the Sangamo Journal was sure to add, to show the value of temperance habits in the cholera, we will mention a fact given in a Montreal paper. In that city, about 1/5 of the population died of the cholera, yet but one of the 350 members of the Temperance Society in that place is numbered among the victims. This fact speaks volumes," unquote. Ironically, alcohol was one of the few safe beverages that could be consumed. In fact, during the 1854 Broad Street, London cholera outbreak, one of the few groups who did not get sick were brewery workers. This was a complete mystery to John Snow, who is widely considered to be the first epidemiologist, until it was explained to him that while they were working, they only drank beer. Anti-alcohol preachers were widely popular and seemed to seize the opportunity to promote their agendas directly connecting cholera and alcohol. The popular Irish Methodist preacher John Maffett said, quote, "Put out the wasting fires of intemperance, and you needn't light no funeral torch for the cholera," unquote. Supposed evidence linking alcohol and cholera not infrequently appeared in the news. One account stated that, quote, "In 2 small unventilated rooms, of which some 6 or 7 persons were occupants, the inmates drunk on Tuesday 3 quarts of whiskey. On Wednesday morning, 2 of them were dead. The last 2 died yesterday," unquote. This not only illustrates the importance a sizable section of the population placed on temperance, but also the misunderstanding of the transmission of disease. Temperance advocates presumably meant well, but their actions most likely distracted from the actual cause of illness. Of course, mainstream science was mostly incorrect as well, but the emphasis on quarantine had actually had the chance to do some good. Just as the understanding of the source of the disease was lacking, so was the treatment. In fact, remedies for the disease would not be unfamiliar to a Roman physician. Treatments designed to cure a patient were probably more likely to kill them. A particularly apt description by one author is that of benevolent homicide. The preferred method of treatment was bloodletting. An editorial in the Sangamo Journal suggests that the patient should be bled 10 or 12 ounces. This seems to be a conservative amount, as some physicians recommended up to 30 ounces be let. There are only about 1.5 gallons of blood in an average size human, so this represents a huge amount even to a healthy person. A complicating issue here is that cholera causes massive amounts of dehydration, with severe cases losing up to 1 liter of fluid every hour, a huge portion of which comes from the blood. Because of this, doctors would attempt to bleed patients and either be depriving their bodies of what precious little fluid they had left, or they would find that no blood would be present. In some cases, they would find that the blood had turned into a black jelly-like substance because of the lack of fluids. The tools used for this procedure could be as simple as a small knife, a lancet, scarificator and cups, or even leeches. In addition to bleeding, various types of medicines were used. These ranged from chemical compounds to herbs. The most commonly used chemical was probably calomel, a mercury compound. Not only is it possible for this compound to cause mercury poisoning if taken for an extended period of time, but it's also a strong purgative. Cholera probably did not last long enough for the calomel to cause any real neurological damage, but as a laxative, it would have compounded the dehydration the patient was suffering. Calomel was not the only laxative used. Castor oil was also common, as were enemas. Often, inducing sweating was the goal of treatment. Again, this would have had the effect of dehydrating the patient further. Capsicum, or red pepper, and camphor, a compound found in the camphor laurel, and A.G. Henry's favorite treatment, were used in this. Other common remedies included opium, laudanum, brandy, and even lead acetate and ammonia. During the height of the outbreak in Jacksonville, Jonathan Baldwin Turner found himself in a position where he had to treat one of the students at Illinois College. The student was taken ill, and Turner sent for a doctor, but they were all sick themselves. Turner received some medicine, however, and went to treating the student. Quote, "I thought he would die. His hands shriveled, his eyes shrunk, and his limbs became cold in less than an hour. I thought he was gone. I will either kill him or cure him at once," I said, and I doubled and shortly after quadrupled the ordinary dose. I gave him about 150 drops of laudanum, 2 tablespoons of the strongest tincture of red pepper and pure alcohol, and 2 glasses of brandy. This threw him into a perspiration and, by repeating it once an hour, broke up the disease. Turner was undoubtedly not the only person who found themselves in a position where they would need to treat the disease themselves. The formulary of Wallace and Dillard Drugstore of Springfield, shown here, is the fourth building down, contains several compounds of the treatment of the disease which would have been for sale. Apparently, they were always on the lookout for new recipes, as a newspaper clipping containing a treatment for cholera is pasted to the back cover. Most of these treatments contain some mixture of calomel, camphor, capsicum, and opium. One even contains lead acetate. Almost none of the treatments which were administered for cholera had any merits. The modern day treatment is simply rehydration, either orally or intravenous. Experiments were actually attempted on intravenous treatments, and although they showed promise when they worked, they were eventually abandoned for being too dangerous. The epidemic died down by mid-1834. It was still on the mind of residents, though. Andrew Cunningham, a traveler from Great Britain who was touring the area, wrote, quote, "We next day got to Peoria, on a very young but thriving town. We have lately been in the district in which cholera was very prevalent. Our driver was very much afraid of it. He certainly had reason to fear. Cholera was a highly dangerous disease that affected a vast section of the population. It returned to the area in 1854. Several people suffering from cholera were discovered at Klein's Row in Springfield on June 29th. The fate of these people is unknown, but residents Joseph Gomez, John Brewer, and Mrs. Freeman were allowed the total sum of $27 for caring for them. During the Civil War, the disease would again become a problem. The early 1870s brought the last real outbreak of the disease in the West. By then, the mode of transmission was known and sanitation techniques were advancing, so the lethality had diminished. Since then, cholera has mostly fallen into the footnotes of history in the United States and is a distant memory of the past in Illinois. Thanks for listening.
Here. Thank you for your program, Mike, and letting us know more about some of the medical history that we have here in the Central Illinois area. Knowing that cholera was just one of the many outbreaks that took place here in Sangamon County. Do you know of any others that we had to deal with?
Yeah, sure. There were. So the biggest killer of people in this time period was actually tuberculosis. It never actually reached, no one ever really thought of it as a pandemic because it killed so slowly. We also had smallpox to contend with, and then some other diseases that maybe weren't quite as prevalent but still very dangerous would have been dysentery or whooping cough, things like that, measles, things that we have vaccines for now and that we kind of take for granted would have been extremely prevalent and very dangerous at the time.
Well, and Mrs. Lincoln, who was one of our residents here in Springfield, actually was terrified of cholera and scarlet fever. And knowing that it led to a lot of deaths among children when she became a mother, it was terrifying. I can't even imagine parents going through that. So just as a reminder, everybody, if you have a question, feel free to put them in the comments. I see that we have one so far, but if you have one, feel free to leave it in the comments and we'll make sure to get to it. So Mike, throughout your research at the Pearson Museum, you interact quite a bit with objects and images. And so our first question comes from the beginning, and that's from Shelley. She wants to know the map that you used earlier on in your program. So I think it was one of the first slides you had. Can you find it online, or where can we find some of the resources that you used to do your research?
Yeah, so the map actually is on Sangamon Link, which is one of the best local history resources there is. I believe it is a recreation based on early descriptions, but you can find more on there.
For those of you who watch a lot of our programming, Sangamon Link has got to be the Bible for Sangamon County. Do a lot of research on there, and the editors do a lot of really good hard work there, as well as some of the resources you can get at the Sangamon Valley Collection too. So in the midst of your research, Mike, have you located any of the graves of these individuals that passed away from cholera?
Oh yeah, there are graves all over the place. In some cases, there are people buried that, people died of cholera and we don't know where they're buried because there were what were called cholera pits kind of located around Illinois, and these are just basically mass graves for cholera victims. And the closest one that I know of is in Taylor Cemetery, just outside of Riverton. And you'll find that the northwest corner of the cemetery, when you go there, it doesn't have any gravestones. And the story is that's why, is because that is sort of this mass grave for victims. Unfortunately, we don't know how many people are buried there or when they died. My guess is probably the third cholera pandemic, which took place in the 1850s.
While we're waiting on some other questions, one of the things I was thinking about during your talk is when you were talking about quarantining. And I know here in Illinois, we have done some of that for the coronavirus, which we're still learning about. So what do you think we can learn from this cholera pandemic that went through and how people reacted to it? What is something we can learn from history from this type of incident?
Well, with this one and others, we kind of learned that quarantining works. I mentioned earlier that lazaretto in Genoa and cordon sanitaires, and that was one of the few things, if anything, that could actually stop an illness. And they got very, very heavy-handed about this, much more so than we did, or we do. Like I said, military would enforce this. Actually, later on, during the smallpox epidemic around 1904, there were actually shotgun quarantines in Illinois, central Illinois, Springfield and Bloomington. Basically, you would be confined to your home. They put a sign up that said, smallpox inside or something like that. And there would be an armed guard outside your house. And there's at least one instance I found of someone trying to escape and being shot.
Oh my goodness. Those are stories you don't normally hear about.
No.
Because we get kind of nervous with quarantine because we're not allowed to go anywhere. And we're very concerned with our businesses and the health of our community and finding that even balance. And I think no matter what, in the midst of all the pandemics and illnesses that have come through, that's always been the constant question is, when do you have a quarantine? When do you stop everything? And how do you make sure your community can still survive and have businesses still survive in the midst of all this? So it's always been a question. And so we haven't really fine-tuned it yet. But it leads to some other questions that have just popped up. One is from Kathy. When was it discovered that hydration was the cure?
So that would have been discovered after the 1880s when Robert Koch, he was a German scientist, he discovered the bacteria that causes cholera. And at that point, once we kind of discovered that it was caused by germs, that's when we started, when medicine became more scientific, that's when we sort of started stopped trying these old methods of treatment that dated back thousands of years and moved into a more modern era and tried, hydration. And later on, the oral cholera vaccine for severe cases is used, and that was developed too.
How did people react to the cholera vaccine when it was first released?
That's a fairly modern development, so it wasn't, it was looked upon, very favorably. People were not scared of it in any way or anything like that. So they received it pretty well.
And who, do you know the name of the person who found the vaccine for it or created it?
No, I'm not sure of that person's name.
Because we don't really, we know that it takes a while for a vaccine to get created, but back in the 19th century, didn't it take a lot longer, or how did that process go about?
The OCV was developed in the 20th century, so it's pretty recent.
Got it, yeah.
The only vaccine that actually was around back then was the smallpox vaccine, and that was developed in the 1790s, actually.
When this particular vaccine was put in place, how long did it take for them to come up with it, or how did they test it? Were there any type of regulations for it, or because today, I mean, we know the process, but can you explain a little bit more on the early stages of vaccines then for cholera or other illnesses that would pop up?
Well, I can tell you, so the first vaccine, the cholera vaccine, there was no, advisory board or anything like that. Edward Jenner, who developed it, used, there's a similar illness to smallpox called cowpox, and he noticed that these milkmaids who were responsible for getting milk from the cows never developed smallpox. So he decided that somehow the cowpox was making them immune. So he found a milkmaid with cowpox and took some of the substance from the sores that it creates and injected his gardener's 8-year-old son with it, and then waited a couple weeks and then injected his 8-year-old son again with smallpox and waited to see if he developed any symptoms, and he didn't. So after that, it kind of went full bore, and you see people throughout the 19th century when there's a smallpox epidemic advising, boards of health and stuff like this would advise people to get vaccinated, even as far back as the early 19th century. And you have people wondering in newspapers and letters and stuff why people wouldn't get vaccinated for this disease.
That's interesting because as we look at different vaccines throughout history and how they're discovered, it's really neat how scientists are able to hypothesize and come up with these cures because as a community, we get nervous for our family and our friends. And here we have smart, intelligent individuals who are trying to better their community by coming up with a cure. So it's very encouraging to hear those kinds of stories. How do you think the Sangamon County community were able to get through this and survive the cholera outbreak without kind of losing it, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It's so foreign to us, cholera is, and it's unlike anything we've ever experienced as far as a disease goes. It's hard to say, but I think they just sort of put their heads down and pulled together as a community. You had earlier, I said that person from Jacksonville thought that maybe if Springfield had been visited like Jacksonville had, it would sort of fall apart and people would flee. And I think people were sort of so determined to make their life here that they just sort of stuck it out.
Well, we in Sangamon County tend to be a bit resilient when it comes to pandemics or even just different tragic events that happen in our past. And I know that we as a community always try to band together when at all possible. So I think that we can learn a lot from you, Mike, in regards to the history of illnesses and pandemics and how we can look to science to see, what new advancements will come into play for coming up with solutions to help cure individuals who are failing from different elements. And I know the SIU School of Medicine has been working with our communities quite a bit throughout our current state. And I know that you're preserving a lot of the history of what's been going on. So I am encouraged by your passion for your field because we can definitely learn a lot from medical history. We don't really have any other questions listed in our comments. So Mike, can you tell us a little bit more about the Pearson Museum and how people will be able to see it in the future once it reopens?
Yeah, so the Pearson Museum is named for Emmett Pearson, the doctor who he donated our first large collection. And it is a small medical history museum. on the campus of SIU Medicine. And it primarily caters to students and faculty and staff. And it's open to, well, once the pandemic is over with, it's open to guests by appointment. So if you can get a hold of me, we'll take you through and give you a tour.
If you're interested in learning more about the Pearson Museum, is there a website they can go to learn more?
Yeah, you can go to Medical Humanities at siumed.edu.
All right. Kathy had another question for us, and I'll let her ask it because it's a very interesting one. When was the first hospital organized in the area?
The first real hospital was Memorial, actually, and it just sort of started basically it was a house that they bought, and it was the late 19th century. So all this time there was really no hospital, and that was true for a lot of places. There were you would have in small towns like Springfield, you would have traveling physicians. They would come to your house and treat you there and even perform surgeries there. So there wasn't really a need for hospitals until, we reached a certain point. And the traveling physician didn't go away really until the 1950s. So yeah, it was fairly late in the game when hospitals came around.
And when did St. John's end up coming into the area? Because that's the other big hospital.
Yeah, it was not long after that. It was right around the turn of the century, I believe.
And didn't they have like a TB clinic, or was that a smallpox clinic that they had?
So they had the pest house, which was for smallpox patients, and it was, would be in Oak Ridge Cemetery now. At the time, it was just outside Oak Ridge Cemetery. But then there was also Palmer Tuberculosis Sanatorium, and the building is still there today. I believe it's a nursing home or something like that. It's on the corner of Chatham Road and Lawrence.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike, for joining us and telling us a bit about the medical history here in Sangamon County. To learn more about this topic and others, feel free to reach out to Mike at the Pearson Museum, and we'll have Mike give us the contact information for him if you want to schedule a tour after the pandemic has passed or it becomes safe enough to visit. In the meantime, Mike, tell us the most exciting item that you have in your collection that you think is really cool that you think people should know about.
Yeah, we have the formulary for the Cornell and Dillard drugstore, which famously is Lincoln's drugstore. And I did some research into it and found out it actually predates Cornell and Dillard and belonged to Wallace and Dillard, which Wallace was William Wallace, which is Lincoln's physician. And it has all of their formulas for the drugs in it. And one of them is a tuberculosis drug. And underneath it says Governor Ford, which indicates that Governor Ford, Thomas Ford, who was in office from 1842 to 46, was actually suffering from tuberculosis while he was in office.
That's really interesting. That's a side that you don't normally get to hear, especially if you study state history. A lot of the medical sides don't always get shared within that the realm of politics. So it's interesting to see the social and medical side of life when studying politicians and also just celebrities in general of history.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing again and sharing with us your favorite item. Tune in next time with more programs to come for the Sangamon Experience. And if you have an interesting story here in Sangamon County that you would like to share with us for the 200th anniversary next year, feel free to email the Sangamon Experience at sangamonexperience@uis.edu. And as a reminder, please be united in safety by wearing your mask when you go out in public and washing your hands. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and we will see you again soon.